Please welcome Semafor General Manager and Global Head of Public Affairs, Bennett Richardson.
Come on in, guys. Get a seat. Got a few more down front here. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm Bennett Richardson, General Manager and Global Head of Public Affairs at Semafor. Semafor is the world's fastest growing independent news platform, which we're really excited about. Just had a big milestone yesterday. In addition to the remarkable editorial team we built here in Washington, in New York, San Francisco, London, and across Africa, just yesterday we launched our bureau, our third global edition in the Middle East with Semafor Gulf, really relevant to today's conversation, tracking the energy transition and the massive economic transformation happening in the region. So if you're following what's happening in the Middle East, sign up for Semafor Gulf. It's a great read coming out 3 times a week with a tremendous team in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and beyond. Since our first day, less than 2 years ago, Semafor has really been focused on providing leaders and decision makers like yourself with transparent, intelligent journalism to help you do your jobs and make crucial decisions. We're proud to have grown to more than 700,000 subscribers to our leading newsletter, millions of readers on Semafor.com, and as you all know, obviously a thriving live journalism business where we convene events like this across business, technology, policy, and the economy. All the time. We got a bunch of great events for you this month, in addition to this morning's great conversation talking about powering the next generation of American energy, examining the state of reliable energy infrastructure and the ways that the public and private sectors are working together to protect energy security. We wouldn't be here today without our partnership with Southern Company to help make today's event possible. So we appreciate their support. Thank you, Southern Company. You'll hear from one of their top executives a little bit later about the amazing work they're doing to fuel the future of American energy, and a number of other top voices in the space. And now, to kick things off, excited to bring up the Department of Energy's Director of Grid Deployment, Maria Robinson, who will be interviewed by Semafor's newest moderator, our Senior Washington Editor, Alana Shore. So please welcome them up. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everyone. Looking forward to a great discussion this morning. Maria, great to see you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
I wanted to start with the IRA. The government is famously not the most fast-moving institution around.
I've heard.
So what is your office doing to make sure all the IRA money is being spent fast enough clip? You could tell us more about that.
So it's incredible balance. So my name is Maria Robinson. I get the incredible honor of leading the Grid Deployment Office. We're a brand new office, I guess a little less new now, about 2 years old. And the process of developing a brand new office and also getting about $22 billion out the door has been one where we're really trying to balance making sure that we are following all very important regulations while also meeting the moment. And a lot of that has been engaging with industry really closely and helping to understand what is most helpful to folks at this moment in time. Some of that is major funding for the grid. We've got about $10 billion going out in either formula grants or these more competitive grants that are happening. And we acknowledge that as we're trying to meet all of this increased demand around AI and data centers, that this is something that folks are really looking towards, but we want to make it as easy as possible for the other side. Sometimes we're working with enormous companies like Southern Company, who are able to handle a lot of bureaucracy. And sometimes we're working with teeny tiny tribes in the middle of North Dakota who have to send in their applications by mail. So we're trying to make sure that we can work with folks across the entire industry and across the entire state and local government complex to make this as straightforward as possible for them.
And your office has only existed, for about 2 years. So this has been a huge, I imagine, staffing challenge for yourself to kind of get that infrastructure up internally. How has that been?
Getting the opportunity, so about 3/4 of our current staff here, and we've got about 130 folks, have never worked at the Department of Energy before, and about half have never worked in the federal government before. So what actually that has done is been able to bring in folks who have worked in industry or advocacy or at the state government level and bring in that type of expertise that didn't necessarily exist in the Department of Energy before and has such more of a deployment focus where they're really looking at the real world impacts and how we can make sure that all of our processes work at, again, the state level or for companies who are actually going through the process of applying for some of the funding that we have. So it's been a real joy. I encourage folks to take a stake in government. It's a lot of
fun. Speaking of deployment challenges, permitting reform has been a big piece of this whole debate, just in terms of getting obstacles out of the way to get projects going. Congress has been debating several versions of permitting reform proposals for a while. What are your priorities for any workable agreement on that issue?
Sure. So always defer to the White House, of course, on any pending legislation. And as I like to say, if I knew what Congress was going to do, I'd be making a lot more money doing something else in this world. But what we're doing at the Department of Energy is taking advantage of all existing laws. We're really poking through a number of different pieces that haven't been touched before. One of these areas is under Section 216 of the Federal Power Act, which I don't expect anyone here to have actually read. But what that does is allows the Department of Energy to set these really firm deadlines on transmission permitting, and it allows us to be lead agency. So instead of transmission developers and utilities trying to talk to 7 different agencies, Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife, they have one door and one team through the entire process. And that's streamlining. There's been some really great studies done. If that process had been in place over the past 10 years, that would have saved 66 years of bureaucracy. Yeah. So we're really trying to use every tool in our toolbox to make sure that we are not letting the federal government get in the way of any sort of permitting parcels reform going on just ourselves.
Gotcha. So with the understanding that you wouldn't want to get ahead of the White House, how do you view the current congressional proposals as tackling that? Like, are they sort of on the right track? You're looking for something more different, have to say?
We're always just excited to see new ideas in the space. And of course, there's only so much that the federal government can do. I think a lot of folks will tell you that some of the largest challenges are happening at the local level and at the state level. I used to work in state government in a previous lifetime, and I was in Massachusetts, where we have home rules. So every single individual municipality has different rules, and some cities are 5 miles long. And so you have to get permits in every single step along the way. I think there are still challenges to be met that have nothing to do with what we're doing here in DC, which I know people in DC don't love hearing all the time. But we want to make sure that we're having this conversation at a much broader level. Are we engaging counties? Are we talking with city managers and people who are at the city council level, and making sure that they're really well educated about what needs to happen in our energy system as a whole?
When you look at IRA investments allocated so far, how would you grade progress on, achieving grid reliability, basically, and what needs to be done, whether through IRA or other vehicles? You don't have to do A, B, C, D, F, but overall, what's your assessment?
So I think with the tools that we have right now, we're doing the best that we can. There's nothing that we can do about hurricane season, which is the thing that keeps me up at night right now. We're already on G, H, I think maybe getting towards I already, and then at the end of September. And so it's making sure that we have all the different pieces in place. I see one of my colleagues here from the manufacturing and energy supply chain parts of the Department of Energy that's really looking ahead to make sure that we've got all the pieces in place. During the pandemic, there were different parts of the supply chain that became problematic for the energy space for basic grid reliability. But at the same time, we're doing these massive investments to upgrade our grid, certain parts of which are not just living in the 20th century, but maybe even a little bit before that. And you have to remember that the vast majority of the electric grid is over 75 years old. If we treated our roads and bridges like that, where we didn't invest in them for 75 years, what would you expect the number of potholes that would happen? You wouldn't expect to be able to drive your car. The fact that we're doing as well as we can is amazing, but we still need to invest more. And so we're excited. Hopefully soon we'll have some more announcements of funding, but we're already investing in sort of interregional transmission across the board. We've got about $1.2 billion of that. $3.5 billion through this grid resilience and innovation partnerships program that we've got going on. And then some really great work in these formula grants going to individual states where they're able to, plug holes in areas where they've always wanted to do a certain project to upgrade the grid here. I heard of a place where they're looking to do that at a marine terminal, but they haven't been able to figure out where they can get the funding for it. So we're really excited for all those different investments to show up in the grid over the next couple of years.
Fascinating. And when it comes to, funding need, you say you're hoping to get some more soon, but the IRA itself, has that been sort of a useful, durable vehicle for you guys to get those grants?
Between the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, it's been transformative. What I also really appreciate is that for folks who didn't necessarily get the funding, it's incredibly competitive. We are so oversubscribed for these grants. We'll have some stats coming out. I can see at least one of our programs is over 800% oversubscribed. And so what's great is seeing some of these partnerships that wouldn't have happened otherwise if we didn't have the federal government, dangling a couple $1 billion in front of people's eyes. And then they suddenly realize that they can make a really good business case based on those partnerships that they have.
Interesting. So what's one partnership that jumps out to you as like particularly innovative?
So one of the programs that we're working with is out of North Dakota, which is the state, as well as MISO and SPP, and these great developers. And they're also working with the individual cities and towns to figure out along the way, are there ways that they can get grants to help make investments, whether it's in the playground that they want to have or in their water infrastructure. And they've been able to create this whole ecosystem where they're taking advantage of all the different programs that we've put together. And that's been just great to see these bigger projects that have felt very difficult to do over the previous 10 years or so coming to fruition in a very real way.
Very cool. Very cool. Moving to electric vehicles for a moment. President Biden has set a goal of half of U.S. auto sales being electric by 2030, but current statistics show the U.S. is far short of that goal. What more needs to be done from your view in order to help get the U.S. to that target?
So as we're looking at different grid upgrades, I think we have to make sure that we are planning further into the future, right? Historically, when we're looking at grid planning, we're doing it on a relatively short timeline. FERC just issued this larger order that's looking to larger timelines and making sure that folks are thinking about load growth into the future, whether it's EVs, but at the distribution system level, there's a ton of upgrades that do need to be made. Distribution poles and wires that actually go to your house and not the ones that you see along the highways. And so we still have to do a lot of work with our individual utilities to make sure that they're prepared for this coming revolution. And I'll say in my own neighborhood, I'm seeing a ton more electric vehicles every single day coming onto the grid, and it's great. And part of this is figuring out, do we have the infrastructure to make sure that we can do vehicle to grid back and forth? And so it can be a bi-directional process and being able to take advantage of that. But we have to put some of that infrastructure into place. There's some great software companies out there doing incredible work, taking advantage of that and making sure that we're really optimizing our future grid.
Talk to me a little bit more about setting up the grid deployment office and what that was like in terms of integrating DOE, which has historically been kind of a research institution, right? And you guys are out there more so than being academic about these big problems. So how has that been?
So it's been such a joy. I've had an amazing time. So we have an entirely new undersecretariat led by David Crane, which is the undersecretary for deployment. And so we're looking at problems in a very different way than the long-term R&D processes that you talk about, but we're taking advantage of the incredible 17 national labs that we have, and their brain power, as well as the other folks at DOE, and figuring out how to turn all of those pieces into reality. We've got an Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations that sort of does that in-between work, some of that transitionary work. And then we're out there saying, there are some incredible technologies out there already, whether it's advanced conductors, which is the wires that could go from place to place and actually carry the electricity. If you upgrade those, you can get, up to 1.5 times, 2 times the amount of electricity. But it's some of those key advancements that are happening at our national labs that are doing the most advanced science in America, and making sure that we're getting that out to the rest of the world, and it's not just sitting in someone's lab somewhere, and instead having some real impact.
You mentioned the bipartisan infrastructure law, which I think is popularly thought of as kind of roads and bridges, but does really, really affect your sector. So how has that been like dealing with two separate pieces of legislation implementation-wise? Challenging, not challenging?
So our office and several of the other offices were actually created because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. When it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act, I'd say that has been truly revolutionary for Treasury, acknowledging that they're doing a ton of work on the tax credits, although certainly some of our colleagues at the Department of Energy are spending a lot of time thoughtfully providing technical assistance. But with those two different areas, we're trying to figure out how all these pieces come together to make a whole package, and making sure that we have, and anything that isn't filling in the gaps, how else can we, through our annual appropriations, do that as the Department of Energy, just to make sure that there's no place where a project can get stuck in the development cycle. So especially transmission is a really good example. So we've got some work through the IRA for larger planning going on, but then we have some financial options, some of which came from the IRA, some of which came from the bipartisan infrastructure law, where we can enter into these capacity contracts. And then we also have these different permitting capacities through the IRA funding as well.
So you mentioned working on the state level, and I noticed in your biography you actually were a state lawmaker yourself. So what has it been like for you to sort of, maybe keep your lawmaker hat on sometimes in terms of understanding how all these complex processes work?
I think that being a lawmaker is so difficult because you have to be reliant on the information that comes in the door. You can't be a deep expert on every single topic, and that can be really complicated sometimes because you're hearing a lot of different pieces of information. And that's why we're always really grateful when lawmakers do come to the Department of Energy, when we're trying to be, really thoughtful and science-based in the work that we're trying to do here. But it is also just one of those areas where you just have to understand sometimes you have to give a little in different sorts of places, and understand that. And most importantly, and I think that we probably don't talk about this enough, all of this work through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act is ultimately going to save people money. And that's the thing that as a lawmaker you think about all the time. You get all these, we used to get cases from people who were wildly overcharged by accident for their electric bill, but they couldn't figure out how to get that resolved. And that's something that lawmakers do on a regular basis through these constituent services. And so you really start to think about how all these pieces impact folks' individual lives. And so that's what helps to drive me every day and make sure that we've got our thoughtful hat on to help folks along the way.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. It's great.
Thank you so much.
Everybody. All right. I am back with one of the top experts in this space, John Williams, Senior Vice President of Technical Services and External Affairs at Southern Company. I've been with Southern Company for many years, a lot of different really interesting positions. So excited to talk about all of them. And thanks again for joining us this morning, John. Thanks for the invitation, of course. Appreciate the support. I feel like we have a sort of three-dimensional challenge here as we think about powering the next generation of American energy. It's keeping up with energy demand, updating energy infrastructure, prioritizing energy transition. So I really want to touch on each side of those. Going to that first one, how is Southern Company navigating the challenges of meeting growing energy demand that we see today?
Sure. So what a great opportunity for our industry and also for our state. You know, we're seeing tremendous economic development in the Southeast, and Southern Company is committed to make sure that we can meet that demand and provide that energy future. Um, and it really speaks to the vertically integrated state regulated utility model, where we are looking at holistically looking at how we're going to serve our customers from a generation perspective, transmission, distribution, all of the solutions that are available to us. What makes the most sense for our customers, working through a transparent process to spring 2,200 megawatts of carbon-free base load energy onto the grid to provide benefits for all the people of Georgia. And because of that, I mean, we have businesses looking to come to Georgia, looking to relocate there, add manufacturing things there, because they know that we have reliable, affordable energy to support their needs.
No, it's really interesting to think about that energy quality, energy security, and how that can benefit and impact the economic strength of a community like Georgia. Wanted to touch on the energy transition. You know, obviously top of mind with New York Climate Week and the UN General Assembly coming up next week. A lot of conversations will be around countries' net zero commitments. Tell us what you think about the importance of a diverse energy portfolio in trying to achieve those net zero targets.
Sure. Southern Company has long had the all of the above approach to our energy planning and market. Again, working through our market structure, how do we deploy the right technologies that make the most sense for our customers to provide that clean, safe, reliable, affordable energy that they need. We're adding renewables. We expect to quadruple our renewable portfolio by 2030. We've just added the new Vogtle units. We're adding battery storage. We've added gas. We're building combustion turbines in Georgia now. We've added combined cycle in Alabama. That is how we're going to meet this future. But we're also doing lots of research and development to make sure that we're staying abreast of all the technologies that will help us reach that net zero future through carbon capture. Whatever those technologies might be, we want to make sure that we're doing that R&D in-house at the National Carbon Capture Center there near Birmingham to make sure that we know the technologies that are going to help us get there.
That's exciting. It's funny to hear that growth across all those different forms of energy. Wanted to talk about one that's near and dear to your heart with nuclear and with Vogtle 4. Obviously, before your current role leading the Vogtle 3 and 4 project, having just brought online our country's newest nuclear units, now the largest clean energy facility in the country. I think I read that it's powering more than 1 million homes and businesses with clean carbon-free energy. What lessons are there that you all saw in bringing that online for the rest of the industry about building more nuclear, more next generation clean capacity for America?
Sure. So, I mean, Vogtle was essentially a first of a kind technology deployed here in the United States. And it's been, 15 years. So we began with certification with the Public Service Commission in 2009. We kind of had a number of challenges. It's been very difficult, but we persevered, and we believed it was the right thing to do for our customers in 2009. And we believe today, now that they're online, it was the right thing to do for our customers. But we've learned a number of things along the way. The lessons learned applied from 3 and 4. We saw significant cost reductions in 4 versus 3. We saw significant improvements in times for testing and commissioning of Unit 4 versus 3. And so all of that has been captured and learned, and we're going to share that with anyone who wants to build new nuclear. One of the things that kind of 2 big lessons that we learned. One is around engineering. So it's important for you, before you begin construction, that you've got the design far enough along so that you can support efficient construction. We saw early on in the Vogtle project that changes to the design, changes to how we were doing module construction impacted our construction timeline and how we intended to build the unit, which ultimately had downstream effects for that unit. So one of the things we tell all of the suppliers that are out there, all the technology suppliers that are out there today is, hey, you need to get that design farther down the road before you start to build. But the second thing is to build resiliency in your organization around deploying these types of technologies. This is hard. And so how do you create an organization and get the right partnerships? So we were very fortunate. Georgia Power has 3 co-owners that own the Vogel plants with us. And we worked very well together, bringing our best talent to the project to make sure that we could make the right decisions and move forward. We had a great relationship with labor, who worked with us through the COVID pandemic. And so while most people were working from home, we were continuing to build Vogel 3 and 4. And then lastly, constructive regulatory environments, both with state regulators and with other, federal regulators, to make sure we had the right incentives to keep moving forward and supporting us as we work to do that.
That's great. Yeah, and we'll come back to that public-private kind of collaboration in a minute. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned kind of resiliency. I want to talk about a couple of different forms that energy resiliency can take. As Maria mentioned, the hurricane season, one of the top priorities for the Department of Energy. You have to imagine what's on your mind as well. Talk to us about how you think about resiliency in light of extreme weather events and in moments like September during hurricane season. How do you think about that across Southern Company?
Sure. So, I'm a nuclear engineer by trade, grew up in the nuclear industry. Our plants are designed to be extremely resilient, to withstand just about anything. So how do we take that type of mentality and apply it to the entire grid? And I would say we've been, obviously working through our market structure, working with our state regulators to make sure that we're able to make the investments to ensure that we can build the reliability and the resilience into the grid. So whether that's establishing the right reserve margins for summer period and winter period, and making sure that we have those, making sure we're able to make the right transmission and distribution investments to protect the grid when we go through those storms. And then lastly, as we have those, I think December 22, we had Winter Storm Elliott hit our service territory. Southern Company was very fortunate that we were able to support the loads within our service territory, but we also learned where we were vulnerable. So how do we take those lessons learned? And then harden the system and make sure that we're making the right investments so we can see where those are going to be the most valuable for us.
Absolutely. And another facet of energy resiliency is really about energy security. What steps is Southern taking to achieve energy independence and to protect against potential supply chain disruption?
Sure. I'll hit a little bit on my nuclear fuel background. I spent a lot of time procuring nuclear fuel. And you learn a lot about supply chain resiliency and protection on something as unique and specialized as making sure we have a reliable supply of nuclear fuel. And Southern Company has established partnerships with suppliers that share our values, that make sure that they appreciate what we're trying to do, that we have long-term relationships, and those relationships work together to make sure that we have a reliable supply and they understand what we need. And so because of that, we've made strategic decisions about not doing business with certain countries. With the Russian-Ukraine conflict, we chose not to procure nuclear fuels from Russia. So we've been essentially insulated from the challenges associated with that because we believe that was the right decision for our customers at the time. We are though looking at how do we broaden our supply chain? How do we identify new suppliers that we haven't had in the past, and how do we bring them into those partnerships that I talked about, and making sure, and then utilizing those partnerships to understand where are their pinch points, where are their challenges, so that we can help them overcome those challenges, and then support their investment in deployment of new facilities and additional facilities through additional supply contracts or offtake contracts, which we've done in fuel.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good symbiotic relationship, not just sourcing those new new sources of supply. Last question, you mentioned how important the Vogel 4 project, that productive collaboration with state and federal legislators and regulators was. Obviously, new energy projects also need great energy infrastructure. How does Southern partner with federal and state governments to advance energy infrastructure, especially in places like transmission lines?
Sure. From a state perspective, it really goes back to that market structure and that integrated resource planning, where we engage with our regulator on a routine basis to make sure that we're doing that holistic planning for our system, that we're making the right investments now so that in the future we can supply that load. And that's where We have 27,000 miles of transmission lines in our service territory. And that was done through that holistic process of planning our grid. At a federal level, we're working on both sides of the aisles to make sure that we're reaching the right solutions, to make sure that we're getting legislation that is going to be durable, that's going to provide the best outcomes for our customers, whether that be around permitting, whether that be around nuclear incentives, all of those things that are critically important to our customers. We want to make sure that we're engaging both sides. And that's been our history, and we're going to continue to do that.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, John. Really appreciate you being here. And thanks again, not only for your leadership in the space, but also for Southern Company's partnership on today's event.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's my pleasure to bring back up Senior Washington Editor Alana Shore. She's going to be interviewing Chip Palombi, who's our Head of Charging and Infrastructure at Beta Technologies.
So when we think of electric transportation, we often think of buses or electric cars, but Beta and Chip are working on electrifying the skies. So Chip Palombi, welcome. You're joining us to discuss this growing electric aviation industry. My first question is, can you tell us more about this technology, period? Because I, for one, having covered energy for many years, was just unaware of how far advanced and along you are. So tell us more about electric aviation, period, and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So at Beta, I lead our charging and infrastructure team. So by background, I've worked in the energy space for about 15 years now. Predominantly early career focusing on energy storage and working towards a reliable and resilient grid with groups like Southern Company. And about 5 years ago, joined Beta Technologies to deploy a safe, reliable, and interoperable charging network. So what Beta is working on is electric aircraft, both VTOL and conventional fixed wing. So VTOL means they take off and land like a helicopter, but have forward flight like an airplane. And fixed wing are airplanes that operate from a runway into a runway. We have 2 prototype aircraft now that are flying regularly, almost daily. Last fall, we did a deployment with the Air Force down in Florida and had a 100% dispatch rate on our aircraft. It's a 6,000 or 7,000 pound aircraft, 50-foot wingspan, 6-person aircraft, so it's quite large.
Wow.
Definitely, some people say it's like a drone, but it's, you can put a lot of drones in one of our airplanes. And we're flying those, very regularly in all sorts of weather up in Vermont and throughout the East Coast.
Fascinating. So I bet you're not filling them with sports actually, but tell me more about what you're actually using this for so far.
Sure. So right now we use our aircraft a lot for demonstration missions as well as certification work with the FAA. And then our customers are looking at using them predominantly for medical transportation, so organ delivery, and then delivery logistics for middle mile for customers like UPS. And then also passenger mobility with groups like Blade and Air New Zealand.
Fascinating. So speaking of UPS, I mean, there must be a strong economic case for them to rely on you guys. Can you explain that cost-wise?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we're seeing. One of the main motivations of electrification of all forms of transportation, aside from the green portion, which is super important to all of us and core to Beta's philosophy, is the reduced operating costs. And what I think a lot of the delivery and logistics companies are seeing is that years ago they delivered a few pallets with thousands of T-shirts to one retail store, and now they're delivering one T-shirt to 1,000 different customers. So their distribution models for especially consumer delivery and logistics are changing, and that's forcing them to change how they're using their transportation assets, both to reduce cost and reduce greenhouse gases.
Fascinating. So speaking of the economic case, your home base is Vermont, which has a reputation on the federal level as being very blue, but has also elected a lot of Republican governors. So what has it been like on that state level, sort of appealing to both kind of rural communities that might feel more red and blue folks with this economic case for what you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of people, I think, are surprised with how Republican Vermont is at the state level, but federally we are often viewed very blue. We've had phenomenal bipartisan support to keep Beta in Vermont. We have about 700 employees now in Vermont, and we built a large manufacturing facility supported by the Exim Bank with about $160 million of financing through the Exim Bank, and that was really well supported both at the state level and federal level across the aisle.
Do you find it easy to make the economic case on the state level, even though electric aviation, right, is so little understood by so many folks?
Yeah, I mean, the job growth that comes along with it, being able to support manufacturing domestically, as well as increasing domestic energy supply. Because we often look at not only installing the charging hardware, but also in the future how we can increase renewables either on site or with like a distributed community type generation.
Interesting. So your company, or at least your type of company, kind of sounds like the poster child for the IRA and its goals. I mean, you're building a clean, innovative energy product in America. So talk to us about how the IRA has affected what you do and how you message what you do.
Yeah, I think it really shows that there's strong economic growth potentials, both to increase jobs, because it's a new sector, right? And we're not necessarily displacing traditional aviation. Like someone's not going to say, oh, do I use the jet for this or the Beta aircraft? They're flying very different mission profiles. So it's not a displacement, it's additive to the aviation environment that's there. So when we say we're increasing jobs in this segment, it's not that we're taking them from someplace else, right? There is a population in Vermont that we work with, and we've done a great job to provide some education resources and worked extensively with the state as well as state colleges in the Northeast to help train up people. And we've seen that the energy infrastructure portions of the IRA, especially around EV charging, has really worked well for the growth of our charging network.
Fascinating. And what more are you looking to see in terms of, we've discussed earlier in this program, there's a lot of IRA money yet to go out the door. How are you hoping to see that allocated, and what are you at Beta specifically hoping to get?
I think what we would be looking for is some form of tax credit for the purchase of electric aircraft, very similar to what's available for terrestrial EVs. And then also, I think Maria did an awesome job talking about it. The Department of Energy and others have done a really nice job at the federal level. We're working now in almost all 48 continuous states to deploy charging, and even city to city, neighboring cities have very different ways that they're practically deploying those funds, which makes it a bit inefficient for our team. So I think one of the things, maybe not directly like how many dollars do we want, but just procedurally and tactically to streamline that process for consistency would help everyone.
Which brings us to permitting reform. I don't know how closely you're following the congressional debate, but are you hoping for legislation on that level, or a state level guidance, really whatever works?
Yeah, state level guidance, there still seems to be some uncertainty, especially now as we're bringing electrification of transportation to the FAA, which is something that they're relying heavily on their partners at Department of Energy and NREL to help really be those subject matter experts. But the first time, we went to install an electric aircraft charger at an airport, like there wasn't an approval process within the FAA for that, and they weren't aware with how real and near term this was. When we go to utilities or airports and tell them we want to install an electric aircraft charger, they're like, cool, that's for 2033. And you're like, no, we actually, we have airplanes now that are flying, and we're flying them daily or multiple times a day. And I think the speed at which the industry is progressing and the need that that's generating for infrastructure is really far ahead of what most people expect.
Very interesting. Speaking of those chargers, I was looking at the map of where you guys operate, and things seem kind of concentrated on the East Coast, but you talked about further expansion in the West. How is that working out, and what are the challenges to that, just scaling up wise?
Yeah, I think scaling up wise, again, it gets back to the consistency of permitting. Every new airport we go to, every new state, county, city has a different process. So a little bit of it's trial by fire. Unfortunately, there's usually not a very clear flow chart. Here's the approval process. So, the permitting package that one county may want is very different from the others. Our East Coast focus is really to serve Beta's flight test needs immediately, and now we're building out networks supported by our customers for their missions. We have organ delivery flights that'll be starting. That'll be our first mission set all up and down the East Coast, and now we have customers who are motivating the installation of chargers at West Coast airports. So we have some online now in California, and more to come soon in California.
Fascinating. So you mentioned, tax credits that would serve electric aviation. How close are we to that? Are you working with anyone on the federal level for language? What can we expect?
Yeah, we're working on that. I'm not sure exactly how close we are on that, but it's something that is definitely top of mind for our team and I think the whole industry.
Interesting. Um, you also mentioned organ delivery, which is kind of an unexpected sector for you guys to be specializing, but also one that's hugely important to public service. How did that work out? And is there an economic case you need to make there, or it's different in terms of how you've
Yeah, I mean, operating an electric aircraft is economically beneficial compared to traditional aircraft. I mean, you see similar optic savings compared to EVs versus combustion engine vehicles. The maintenance is probably the largest component on aircraft. Maintenance can be almost half the operating cost. Our electric motors in our aircraft don't have oil changes. We can go thousands of hours, almost life of airframe on the motor. So a typical, for example, just the electric or the engine on a traditional aircraft, some of the traditional suppliers will pretty much sell the engine at cost because the ongoing maintenance has to be done by the OEM of that engine. And that's really where they make all their money is in the maintenance, right? When you have an electric engine that doesn't have oil changes or gearbox or transmissions, all of a sudden that maintenance component goes away, which really means that the operator of the aircraft is spending a lot less money to have it in the air. On the organ delivery side, so there is the economic benefit. It's also the vision of Martine Rothblatt at United Therapeutics. The first organ that we'll be transporting most likely is a lung. And there's a little bit of a irony if you're putting greenhouse gas into the air to move along, right? So
like that, yeah.
And that's part of really her vision and early vision to help motivate the creation of Beta itself was how do we use all battery electric aircraft to move lungs.
That is fascinating. So we're having conversations with people across the industry this morning about how the grid can keep up with the pace of a lot of demand, right? Reliability, durability. Do you feel like outdated tech and grid reliability is a huge obstacle to you, or it's more like tax credits and other sort of saturation related proposals?
I think the grid is much more robust, I think, than a lot of people expect. Southern Company and all the utilities have done a great job ensuring high reliability. PERC does an awesome job, watching them on that. When we think about electric aircraft charging versus ground vehicle charging, there's really airports that we're focused on now, and in the future, vertiports. When we contrast that with the ground space, there's millions of parking lots, hundreds of millions of homes, right? So the solution space for where you need the power and where you're going to put the chargers is much smaller for us and easier, I think, for a utility to plan ahead for. Our aircraft is charging at a few hundred kilowatts, a little bit more than say a Tesla supercharger. But in the future, we have people, not too distant future, people making much larger electric aircraft that are going to need megawatts of power. So I think our size aircraft for entry into service is a good primer to help plan the whole industry.
Well, on that note, it was a pleasure to have you. Thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Now we welcome Sean Congressman Sean Casten, for those of you who don't know him, Democrat from Illinois, you are the vice ranker on this Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and you also sit on the Financial Services Committee. You have a huge background in climate, one of the biggest climate hawks on the Hill, a former renewable energy executive, so you bring a lot to this discussion. I wanted to start actually with the campaign a little bit about climate messaging itself. During the debate last week, the vice president talked a lot about climate, and she kind of sounded a little bit all of the above in the sense that she was talking about gas, declining to address any limits on fracking. Did that surprise you? And how do you think we should be talking about climate going forward in the campaign?
So I'm still at heart a clean energy guy who had to convince people to buy clean energy. We build assets inside industrials that recovered waste energy. And if you had asked me the same question in that context, you would get laughed out of any marketing realm of you're not going to go into Dow Chemical and say, let me tell you how to be more moral, right? Right. You've got to translate it into the language that matters for them. And I think we tend to talk about climate messaging in the sense of like, well, why are we not convincing voters that they should care about the thing we care about instead of can we do a better job of translating this into things that voters do care about?
Yeah.
You know, when I ran in 2018, my pollster said, okay, this is an election about healthcare, it's an election about this, that, and the other. And I said, what are your top three issues? And I said, climate change, and climate change. But we're going to talk about this in ways that resonate. So are you concerned that the price of energy is too high? Well, let's talk about how to get you access to an energy source where you don't have to pay for fuel. Are you concerned about reliability? Well, let's talk about the benefits of having a grid with more generation closer to load that doesn't rely on the grid. Are you concerned about global immigration trends? Well, let's talk about the desertification of North Africa and how that's driven by climate change. Like you can have a conversation about climate change, but you need to start by understanding where people are at. And I think the framing around do we do a good enough job of talking about climate, I think is a completely separate question from saying, did we get the votes to pass the biggest climate bill ever? We called it the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah, we did. And we got the votes to do it. And people are pretty excited about it, even if we didn't necessarily say, get all preachy and say this is about climate change.
So you're making a really interesting point. I mean, how do you feel like your party is doing on that score? Are we talking less in terms of the black and white morality?
We're doing better, but we have a long way to go. You know, I think one of the challenges that strikes me in Congress is that the I'm oversimplifying, but only barely. I think the Democratic Party often talks about environmental policy and calls it energy policy, and the Republican Party often talks about energy policy and calls it environmental policy. And I think we all need to do a better job of understanding that energy policy is this nexus between those two things, and we need to understand both. And that does not mean you don't fight like hell to provide a sustainable planet. It just means that you can't dismiss the concerns of people who are viewing this from a different lens and hope to make progress. And I think all of us in Washington need to do a better job of that. I mean, I've long maintained that really investing in climate presents the biggest wealth transfer in our history, and it's a wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers. There is no one who owns a solar panel who worries about whether someone's going to build a coal plant next to them tomorrow. Everybody who owns a coal plant is nervous that somebody might bring cheap renewable energy into their node on the power tomorrow, and that transfer creates a lot of wealth for consumers. It is necessarily a complete reorientation of U.S. energy policy towards consumers, away from producers, which I would argue it always should have been at. But it also was going to leave a lot of folks behind. And how do you make sure that as we create this bigger pie, everybody gets a slice? And I think that's a good and healthy conversation. I don't think we've done a good enough job of talking about it for what it is. Instead we viewed it as like, well, I'll give you a little bit of bad in exchange for a little bit of good, and we'll never actually talk about where there should be opportunities for win-wins.
So how do we view the IRA in the context of the point you just made about energy policy versus environmental policy? Because it made huge progress, right? The biggest investment in American history, but it only gets us 40% of the way to that PCC target, environmentally speaking. So what more needs to be done, and how differently would you want to talk about that?
So I take it from your question that you're just as offended by Senate rules as I am. I mean, look, the IRA came out of Build Back Better. Build Back Better came out of a report that we prepared on the Climate Committee in the 116th Congress, where I believe I could say that was the first time that any committee of Congress said we want you to score our work based on the greenhouse gas impact, not just on the fiscal impact. And so our proposal was about an 80% reduction in U.S. CO2 emissions. The reason we only got 40% in the IRA, and like, be clear, this is the biggest climate bill ever passed by any government in the history of the world. Like, we should dance in the ends of that. Like, we can say only 40%, but like celebrate what we did. But the reason we only got to 40% is because under Senate rules, which the Senate can change, if we want to change energy policy in such a way that the taxpayers don't spend a penny, but we incentivize participants in the energy industry to redeploy capital in ways that will benefit consumers, will benefit the environment, everybody can win. That requires 60 votes. If, on the other hand, we want to change tax policy to change the amount of federal dollars that go to deploying these things, that's subject to the Byrd rule, and that only requires 50 votes. So the Senate has decided in their wisdom that making policy changes should be harder than making fiscal changes. It's a dumb rule. That's why we got that, right? So the IRA is primarily a tax credit bill.
Right.
It is long on carrots, very short on sticks, which I think is political genius, because we are creating a huge number of people and businesses who want to sustain the benefits that are out there, instead of creating a huge number of people who want to get rid of the penalties that are out there. And it's making a huge difference in the United States. But we still have left behind, I mean, the obvious thing that's in the news right now, like, why didn't we do transmission permitting? Why haven't we done, things like performance-based rate making for utilities? Because they don't cost taxpayer money, and the Senate has decided that that's too hard.
Believe me, as a congresswoman, I love bringing the legislative filibuster into an energy conversation. It might be here to stay, though, right? So looking ahead, do you feel that more is needed beyond the IRA to get us closer, given the limitations of reconciliation, right?
So what we knew, even out of the climate committee, so even on our 80% goal, and this is just as true with the IRA, we knew that the three biggest things pacing the realization of the goals of the IRA was, number one, transmission policy, because it is vastly easier, like orders of magnitude easier to build a gas pipeline in this country than it is to build a transmission pipeline, and that's slowing it down. Number two was labor markets, because the sheer amount of jobs required to build out all of these assets exceeds the U.S. labor force. And in fact, since the IRA passed, the U.S. really, for the first time in 40 years, the economy has consistently been creating jobs faster than workers. Thank you, immigrants. You get the job done, but that is, that's a policy issue we got to go through. And then the third is, which is a little bit more nuanced, but what is U.S. industrial policy and what is our goal? Because as we have moved to bias in favor of U.S. manufacturing in the IRA, and I would point out that we did not give a damn about U.S. manufacturing in a pre-IRA world. Nobody ever sat up and complained that we are not making steam turbine casings in the United States anymore. Nobody ever sat up and complained that the catalysts we need in electrostatic precipitators at the back end of a coal plant were dependent on countries that we didn't have friendly relations with. Nobody cared about that stuff, right? But we decided entirely to care about that stuff. And so there's a shift going on. You see it a lot in the solar industry of should we penalize companies for using content that is not manufactured in the United States, which we did not do for other parts of the power sector? Or should we make it easier for developers to build power plants that are going to be lower cost to finance and therefore can provide lower cost power? And how do we think about that if the trade-off is, Uyghur slave labor in China at a Chinese factory? I'm not suggesting those are easy answers, but I think that pacing question of what does U.S. industrial policy become in a world where we want clean energy, but we also want to make sure that we're maximizing U.S. jobs. Those three things are pacing full realization of the IRA's goals.
Interesting. Well, permitting reform is also, according to a lot of things, including yourself.
Well,
Right. So to pivot back to that for a moment, you have a separate proposal from what's known as Mansion Barrasso on Capitol Hill. Where do you hope to see this debate go for the rest of the year? I understand the Senate is really keen to get a vote on that. Many of them, I'm sure you would rather sort of perhaps hit reset and examine your plan next year. Where does this
sit? I think there's one conversation about Senate process and there's one conversation about House process, and then there's an entirely separate question about what should U.S. policy be. I've been very pleased that the Senate process has incorporated significant parts of what we did in our state bill, the cost allocation provisions and some of the interregional coordination. There's a handful of sections that are in there essentially verbatim, so that's great. What is pacing the realization of a cleaner, cheaper grid is our ability to build transmission. what is pacing our ability to keep an oil and gas industry alive that is steadily losing market share is our ability to build export terminals. Those are two entirely separate questions. And Manchin Barrasso is basically trying to pull those two together on the theory that gets you to enough votes in the Senate. And I am not a senator. I will defer to them to what gets in the Senate. What I know in the House is that there is only one transmission permitting reform package that has, I think Mike Levin and I are up to 81 co-sponsors. We've got co-sponsors across the entire ideological divide. So there's really no way that you get something through the House that isn't centered on that plan. And so I think there's a conversation going on right now that's, gets very wonky around, could there be something that comes out of the Senate that gets bolted onto a must-pass bill and a lame duck? And that's really boring inside baseball kind of stuff. But I guess in my 6 years of Congress, the next time I see legislation originate from the Senate and jam the House will be the first time.
Fair point. Have you talked to the Harris campaign about this issue and your approach?
So we've had a lot of ongoing conversations with the White House and of course the people who are in there. I think the Harris campaign, let's be honest, the Harris campaign is, what are we now, 58 days old?
Yeah.
So the conversations with, the Alizadis, the John Podestas of the world, and then there's a separate conversation of okay, who exactly are going to be the people who are managing the coordination of it on this side. But I think at this point it's really a lame duck conversation. And I should give Senator Manchin credit, if somewhat begrudgingly, that when we controlled the House and the Senate and the White House, we knew the transmission was pacing, and we didn't have a vehicle to get it done. And so Senator Manchin brought out his vehicle that was similar to Manchin Barrasso, a little bit different, but brought that out. And what we know from that time is that package never had the ability to pass the House, and in fact it never had the votes in the Senate either. So it was a moot point. What we also know is that the Republican Party has fundamentally no real desire to do transmission reform. And the proof point of that was that when the control of the House then flipped, the Republican Party introduced H.R. 1, which stripped all transmission pieces out of this and only did the fossil fuel ends of that deal. Mm-hmm. Had they coupled transmission on there, it would have been an interesting test. But I think it's sort of like the tell, right, of where the priorities are focused. And and I think shame on us collectively as legislators that we didn't have a vehicle set to move when we had the political will to get it done, which was really why Mike Levin and I put together CETA, because we said we've got to have the vehicle ready for the next time that door is opened. And so that's now the vehicle, and we've got to get it done. But I think the proof of the pudding is that we've already tried once that let's do some, not all of what we need on transmission, and staple that to things that are not really necessary on the fossil fuel side. That has the votes in the House, and I think it still doesn't have the votes in the House.
But it does sound like you haven't given up on the late back. I mean, you've said conversations should be continuing.
Yeah, look, when the window opens, let's run through it. And I think part of what we really have to do, and we've tried to do this in our legislation, is if you fix the profit incentives in the utility sector, permitting is really easy. If you don't fix the profit incentives, permitting is a fight between somebody who doesn't want to do what you're telling them to do, right? We can talk about NEPA, we can talk about, interconnect delays, we can talk about all the complications of, I can bore you to tears and intimidate you with electrical engineering and power factor and voltage stabilization. And you surely don't want to be responsible for reliability issues. So let's take 10 years to review an interconnection line because we don't want to compromise reliability. Tell me one regulated utility that ever struggled to get a plant interconnected that they owned and controlled in their own service territory. Tell me, look at what happened after Order 1000 came through. We have built a ton of transmission wires, primarily interregional, not intra-regional, not interregional, and almost exclusively to address reliability concerns, and virtually Zippo to address like price arbitrage issues. You know, you still have these huge complicated nodes. So it's not a technical issue. It's not a permitting issue. It's people responding to where the economic incentives are. And so if we're going to do transmission permitting right, again, Congressman and I have tried to do this in our bill. The Manchin-Barraza really hasn't touched this. You have to fix the profit incentives first and make sure that everybody has a vested interest in the same outcome. And at that point, the permitting challenges substantially go away because everybody wants to make money.
Well, on that note, thank you, sir, for a great conversation.
Thank
and
you.
I will welcome back Bennett Richardson.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to all of our speakers. Before I let you all go, just wanted to put a couple of upcoming events on your radar. This Thursday morning, back here in Gallup, we're going to be convening a great conversation around the American gaming industry, looking at the explosion of sports betting, the expansion of casinos. We'll have team owner Mark Ein here speaking with us, as well as Dina Titus, the congresswoman who oversees the gaming caucus. That's Thursday morning, which will be great. Many of you will be continuing the energy conversation if you're going to be up at UNGA or Climate Week next week in New York. 2 great nights of net zero receptions up there on Monday and Wednesday. You can find out more about all of those at semafor.com/events. Thank you again for being here. Thank you to Southern Company for being our partner for this morning's event. I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.